Good evening, everyone. Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome to Connect Africa. So we are here, myself and Kwame, bringing you a topic really not often talked about, but a very crucial one to understand what's going on in the continent. So that is being Africa's ownership of production means and infrastructure. We are going to raise a couple of points. That is, for example, why Africa is not owning, even after being free from colonization, why it's not owning manufacturing, whether it's infrastructure or industry. Secondly, what is the impacts of this in the continent? And thirdly, we are going to bring, compare and contrast like those state-owned and privately owned companies or manufacturing or infrastructure, whatever is privatized in the continent. So for that, we have here our own Kwame Gonza. Welcome, Kwame. How are you today?
Thank you very much, Mahlet. I'm doing well, and greetings to everyone who's watching us. As you rightly mentioned, we're going to look at the importance of ownership on the African continent as Africans, of the means of production, ownership of the means of production, and also, in that we will talk about the so-called factors of production, but of course not in an academic manner, but in a simplified way. We're not going to talk about economics, and of course in that we will talk about also infrastructure, and of course again in a simplified way, which is easy for everyone to understand. So I don't want anyone to be scared that we're going to bring academic stuff over here. We're going to talk about practical things, and well, of course, where we want the continent to go in that regards, because we have to start envisioning where we want the continent to be. If we are talking about the fact that the continent is not being led well by the current or the outgoing generation of leaders, the second generation of leaders who came after the first generation after independence, then we have to start envisioning and then provide an alternative. It doesn't make sense for us to come here every day and criticize and then say things are not going well, or even complain, not only criticizing but complaining about things. Sometimes of course people are not criticizing, but rather they are complaining about the situation or dissatisfied about the situation, and they are not complaining because they want to complain, but of course they are dissatisfied. So we don't want to be here and only concentrate on being dissatisfied with the situation, but we want to look at also the solutions and
Yeah.
start envisioning, as this generation, where do we want this African continent to go? Where do we want this continent to be? So we have to start envisioning that, so that if we get a chance to come to power as the third generation after independence, the third generation of Africans after independence, then we will get a chance to implement these ideas which we are talking about here. So, but of course, that requires us to look at the mistakes that have been made in the past since independence up to now, especially by the second generation, which gave up the continent and did not fight for it. So we'll correct that, and then, of course, we will move forward with the continent and how we want it to be as the African continent. So that is what we are going to talk about with Mahlet today and discuss. Thank you so much, Mahlet. You have muted. You have muted yourself. Sorry.
Yeah, I said you were getting into it, so I was trying to stop you. Uh, yeah, so let me throw the first question, as it has been more than 6 decades since independence happened uh, in Africa, and except currently looking at it, except few countries, actually less than a handful of countries are embarking on state owning their own resources, infrastructure or industry or mining, whatever, and that being namely the Sahel Alliance, like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. But for the rest, I think we are seeing even the state-owned companies are being sold uh, to foreigners, okay, whatever reason is behind. And nothing is really happening in terms of Africa's ownership of production means and its infrastructure, or yeah, anything of like that. Why is it so?
Yeah, so I think that for us to understand why the continent is in the state in which it is, with the lack of ownership of property, is important for us to first define, of course, what public ownership is. Public ownership simply means the government representing the interests of the people uh, in the economy. That is simply what it means. And it means that when the government owns certain properties in a country, it represents the interest of the people. So putting aside what they claim that the government is inherently incompetent or it cannot manage the resources, and therefore we need to bring in the private sector. So basically, that is the ownership by public. Now, of course, on the other hand, we have the private ownership by individuals of property within the country. Now, for a nation to develop, you need to strike a balance between these two, the private and then public ownership, not to give, the private sector to give it responsibilities which are not supposed to be its own, and then the public sector to give it responsibilities which are not supposed to be its own. Now, in this case, since we are talking about public ownership in African ownership, of course, in itself, including, of course, the private and the public sector, it's important to focus on the topic that we have chosen, which is infrastructure and then the means of production, of course. Now, since independence, the African heads of state who came, they realized that whether you're talking about Nigeria and all these countries, whether it is Uganda, most of these African countries, the heads of state after independence realized that the continent was very behind after taking it back from colonialism. Even when you go to Nigeria, you go to Ghana, you go to all these countries, they were nationalists. Many of them were Pan-Africanists. And they thought that as a continent, we have to build up industrial capacity on the African continent. So there was borrowing, but borrowing to invest in assets, and of course, including the infrastructure, including building infrastructure like roads, schools, and others, railway systems, communication systems, all these, and a very good example, of course, is Nigeria and Ghana. If you look at what happened after independence, that Nigeria put up a lot of industries, which were state-owned during that period. Now, this is due to the understanding by these forefathers and foremothers of the African continent that in Africa there was no private sector, to talk of which could compete with the West. All right, and Nkrumah elaborated on this, clearly in his writings. Even he reached a point of saying that uh, capitalism is so complicated a system for newly independent African states to compete. Therefore, these small states, they did not have the muscle to compete with the West, to compete in this capitalist system. Therefore, we needed to come together as African states. And the other thing which he noticed is that we did not have a middle class in the African continent, because it is from the middle class. That middle class was there, but it was almost invisible. It did not have the capability itself of competing with the West. All right. Now, in this, he said that it requires now the state to take center stage and not only build infrastructure, because it is the responsibility of the state to build the best infrastructure if you are talking about industrialization. And we have mentioned this clearly, on numerous times. If you are talking about, and of course, other heads of state have spoken about it, even people like, President Museveni, and others who understand really what industrialization is about. Leave alone people who just come around and they populist leaders. Maybe you can even talk of Nana or people like that. Those people, they don't really understand what they are doing. But we are talking about, and of course, not only Nana Ado himself, but a lot of others, on the African continent, people like Tini, all these people, they don't understand what they are doing. Or if they do understand, they have just sold out their own people for their own interests, their, narrow interests. So those people who understand what industrialization is, understand that you're supposed to build a base. There is certain areas you're supposed to touch if you want to spark industrialization. And we have seen this in China being done, all right? And in that case, it is the state which is supposed to invest in these areas. Number one, you're supposed to provide energy for the people, electricity. That is number one. Number two, you provide transportation system. You provide the cheapest means of transport, all right? If you're going to carry out industrialization, like mining, for example, develop your resources, you need the cheapest means of transportation. And that is railway. You have to provide rail. That is number two, a cheap transport means of transport, and of course, build the roads. Okay. Number three, you're supposed to provide a cheap communication system. And of course, you have to make sure that there's enough food in the country. So these four areas are extremely important. Of course, political, economists and economic strategists like, Jeremy Rifkin, they talk about three sectors. They talk about energy, they talk about transportation, and they talk about communication. You should make sure that communication is easier for the people. So those three sectors, but I have added at the fourth, which is food, because without food, people cannot function, they cannot work, they cannot go anywhere. People need to eat. So you need to have control over these sectors. And of course, people like President Museveni also have mentioned numerous about this if you listen to his speeches. Now, whether Museveni is right in how he's approaching this issue of infrastructure in his country or not, that is another issue. But he has spoken about these things, repeatedly. Now, what happened after independence in the African continent is that the particular heads of state in the African continent understood this, and they rapidly started investing in these, sectors. And the state, they came out with all the power of the state. And if you go all across the African continent, the independence leaders were investing in these sectors in order to be able to spark, industrialization. And of course, that in addition, there's other sectors which you have to add, to complement these best sectors. And of course, that has to do with health. For example, you have to have healthy people, to carry out all these activities. And then you have to have educated people with, education. So you have to educate the people for them to be able to carry out this industrialization. So you can see that these are very important. After you have laid the foundation of the base, then you have to complement that base with other important things, because all these actually are supposed to serve human. They are supposed to have to aid the human in moving forward, in producing, in being productive. All right. So now, if the human is not being productive, it means that there is a problem, in these areas, in how you have approached these areas. So our forefathers, and foremothers after independence understood this, and they heavily invested in this. But unfortunately, because they invested a lot, and Africa actually by 1970 had captured 7% of global manufacturing, the West did not see it well. Okay, they did not like it. The West did not like the fact that Africa was advancing. And of course, it was advancing with the help of the Soviet Union, which is the current day Russia, and also China also used to give, even though China was not very rich, was poor during that period, but China also used to give favorable loans to the African states. So the West did not like it. And all this generation of leaders, even though they understood the right thing to be done, they differed. Of course, they differed in approach. That is where you see people like Nkrumah talking about that if we want to consolidate these gains that we are making, he's saying that we should unify, because there is a force, there's a dangerous force that is coming before us. If we don't unify to consolidate these efforts and these gains that we are making, we got independence, we are starting the reconstruction, we need to unify. So the other heads of state, differed from Nkrumah, and they went in a different direction. And they thought that this process can continue. We can succeed in our own countries by building our own small countries going forward. And Nkrumah had warned them that this is not going to be possible because there is an enemy who's coming. Because Nkrumah foresaw the future. He sort of foresaw the future as a prophet or some sort of sage, and he warned them that we cannot consolidate these gains if we don't come together to unite. Therefore, that is what led to the Monrovia and Casablanca group. The Casablanca group, is where Nkrumah, belonged. The Monrovia group is where the others like Nyerere and all that group, belonged, which was opposing the unification of the continent during that period. And of course, what Nkrumah warned about would later come to pass. All right, in the 70s, by the 1970s, majority of the African heads of state had been overthrown. And yet we had made all these gains, economically. And we were using the power of the state, all right, to drive forward this rapid advancement. And if you look at it, countries like Singapore, which normally people talk about, South Korea, China, all these so-called Asian tigers, and Vietnam, all of them, they actually used the state in the same way which we were using it. And actually, if you go back to the figures of the World Bank during the 60s and the 70s, they had predicted that Africa was going to develop faster than the Asian countries. All right? They did not see any hope in Asia compared to Africa because Africa was advancing rapidly. So the West came in and interrupted that process. Of course, we saw what happened. The African leaders were thrown out who were nationalists. They were removed from power. People like Nkrumah was removed from power with the help of the CIA. And people like Patrice Lumumba were removed from power also and killed by the same CIA and Belgium, Britain working together, the European countries working together. So, and others, Olympio in Togo, Milton Obote in Uganda, all these were removed from power. And they put there some of the most ignorant, because remember that after our independence, most of our heads of state were educated. If you go around and look at the heads of state during the independence period, most of them were educated people. All right, some of them were doctors, most of them were doctors. If they were not doctors, they were at least driven by a strong conviction of the reconstruction, for the reconstruction of Africa. And of course, this is independent of whether they were, for African unity or not. But majority of them were driven by a conviction for the reconstruction of Africa and making Africa a better place. Now, all these people were removed from power, majorly by the West. All right, and what followed later is people who did not have conviction taking power. Some were soldiers, were just military people who don't have even some sort of training or conviction that this is where the continent is supposed to go, and that is where we got people like Idi Amin, who was not educated. And you can see that Idi Amin, the person he removed from power, who was Dr. Milton Obote. Dr. Milton Obote was educated with a PhD. You come to Ghana, Nkrumah was educated, far educated with PhDs. And you look at the people who replaced them later. Some of them were uneducated or without conviction, completely no conviction at all about the progress of the African continent. And this is where actually I always differ with the people who say that Africa's problem is that we don't have leaders. All right. So this is different from, us having leaders is different from having, bad leadership in power. These are two different things. The leaders, we have them, but it's just that the system we are operating right now, it alienates the good leaders and then brings to the fore, to the thrones, the bad ones. So ever since 1970 or 1966, after the overthrow of Nkrumah, then the West took over the political system on the African continent and started installing people like Mobutu Sese Seko. Even Idi Amin himself was brought by the British. All right. So they brought some of the worst leaders, and then they sponsored, wars and sponsored civil wars all over this African continent. And actually, Nkrumah also predicted that Africa will sink when he saw the coups which were happening when he was in Guinea. He said that Africa is going to sink so low, is going to sink, and then a new Africa will rise out of that, which is unrecognizable. And what Nkrumah meant is that the new Africa that will rise out, it will be unrecognizable to the point that what we wanted to build, which he called the African personality, is not going to be there, right? What he meant is that the continent is going to be taken over by neo-colonialism, that it will be unrecognizable from being African. And so this, even we can see it in some of the speeches, which Pierre Lumumba, gave the speech in I think it was in 2014 or 2013. He said that when you look at Africa, you ask yourself, what is happening on this continent, that young people are, young girls and women are watching telenovelas, Mexican telenovelas. They are not proud of our own movies and our own culture. The young boys are watching European football. The African heads of state are sending their children to Europe. They don't trust the hospitals, even what we have. So this is the Africa that Nkrumah was talking about. So the African heads of state, they don't trust even the hospitals they have built on the African continent. They go outside for treatment. And this, you can see people like Buhari, that he almost spent about 6 months, in Britain, for treatment because he was sick. So instead of being treated in Nigeria. So this is what Nkrumah, mentioned, and he foresaw, and of course he prophesied and predicted that it would happen.
The reason is instead of being treated because we don't have such high good treatment centers.
Yes, right? So why not install them?
We don't
you have all this money. So what you have, you are the leader, you are the president. Why not use this opportunity of you're getting sick and say, we have to build these systems. We have to build these health infrastructure in our country. So that is where the problem is. So and all this is not done, because of unrecognizing oneself. You don't understand your worth. You don't recognize your worth. That you think that these people are better than you. All right. And this is something which Nkrumah did not agree with. You look at people like Nkrumah. These are people who never went outside for treatment. They were treated within the country. As a president, even if he got sick, there's a president here, in Uganda who was called Milton Obote, who brought Uganda also to independence. He was never treated from outside the country. If he got sick, he went to the national hospital. That's why he went to, for treatment. So you can say that these people were nationalists and they were Pan-Africans and they loved their country. Now, why am I saying all this? I'm trying to show you that the state played a huge role, and Africa during that period owned our resources, almost owned our resources, but we also built up infrastructure and we owned that infrastructure. Now, what came later on, after the 1970s, is that the West came in and then the so-called structural adjustments came in play. All right, structural adjustments, they were called structural adjustment policies. Those of the IMF and World Bank were unleashed on the continent, and they say that where you people were going is a wrong place. And of course, they are saying all this after removing our leaders who could reason for the continent. All right, they removed them and killed them, and all of them, they exiled them. Some of them were exiled, some of them were killed. Now they started telling the ones they have installed in power that where these people were going is a wrong place. All right, now it is private sector. The economy should be private sector driven. But look, during this period, we did not have a strong private sector. So which private sector were these people talking about? If you ask a question, this West, when they came with their structural adjustments, which private sector were they really talking about? So this was a strategy to weaken the state, the African state, or whatever you may call it, the states, the individual states, so that they should not play a pivotal role in the economic development of their countries. Leave it to the private sector. And there's even a video which has been going across, online, where Nyerere, he's arguing that these people who are saying that leave it to the private sector, tell us which private sector. Okay, and he's saying that don't listen to those people who tell you that leave it to the private sector. Which private sector? And this is simply because the private sector cannot build this infrastructure, cannot build these best infrastructure which we have seen, because for them they are driven by different objectives compared to the interests of the people. So this sort of brainwashed the leaders on the African continent, and they started going in that direction. They neglected their duty of driving the development of their economies and development of the continent, and they started relying on the West, everything to beg from the West. If they wanted a road, now you have to go and beg from the West until if the World Bank allows you to build a road, then you build a road. And if you notice, during all this period, the World Bank abandoned, it never financed any railway infrastructure on the African continent, never, apart from the railway infrastructure which was there after after colonialism. When we got independence, there was no financing of railway infrastructure, and this was actually a strategy on their part. Why? Simply because when you finance railway infrastructure, the railway infrastructure is the cheapest means of transport on land, and if you're going to move goods, the goods are going to be cheap, business is going to be cheap, business is going to boom. So there was no financing of infrastructure like railway. All right, even the roads which they financed, the roads is because the West had control over Africa's energy sector in itself. And of course, we say that these are the most important sectors. These are some of the most important sectors: transportation, energy. So they had control over Africa's energy sector. All right, and that means oil. They were supplying all the oil. Even up to now, of course, they supply almost 80% or 90% of Africa's, oil. So they were making huge profits during this period. So they discouraged and weakened the state. So this was strategic on their part, that they wanted to continue to make huge profits, use Africa as a market, and of course continue to take out the raw materials and kill the creation of a new middle class. Because remember, the strategies which our forefathers and foremothers, the first generation after independence, they were employing, that strategy was going to create a real middle class which would contest and compete with the West. So this, they did not like it. And so they came with this strategy, give it to the private sector. Now, who was the private sector during that period when they were saying that we should abandon everything, the economy should be private sector led? It was the West who came out and bought most of our assets, even the utilities, electricity, and all this, and they started operating those infrastructure. There's no way our economies would grow from there now. So this was basically the problem, and unfortunately, that problem, of course, has continued even up to today. You hear certain heads of state the Nanados, all of them, majority of them on the African continent, always waiting, private sector led, private sector, leave it to the private sector. We are waiting for the private sector, foreign direct investment. Even though people like, people like Dangote have clearly stated and said that we have to grow the continent by ourselves. We should not wait for other people. You hear our head of state still mentioning that we are waiting for foreign direct investment. We have increased the foreign direct investment and stuff like
So
that.
how
So,
how how did this impact the continent? And yeah, uh,
so absolutely, it impacted the continent in such a way that there was no industrialization from then on. And if you compare to 1970 and today, by 1970, Africa had captured about 7% of global manufacturing. Today, we are at 5%. So which means we regressed instead of making progress since 1970. Today, we have gone backwards when it comes to industrialization. We are not making really progress compared to what we had achieved in the 70s. And remember, that is
but
because,
just few years ago, there was, countries even who registered two digits in terms of growth. What happened now?
yes,
Like,
so these registrations, this happened since 2000, all right? Since 2000, the year 2000. And this happened because China was growing rapidly, all right? And we were saying, actually, it was not happening. This growth was not happening because we are industrializing as the African continent, but simply because we are selling more raw materials to China, and China was growing rapidly. So that growth in China, which was happening, if you check China during this period, 2000 up to 2020, China was growing rapidly at 10%, 8%. So that growth was, transferred even to Africa, was sprinkled towards Africa. Now, when China has slowed down, and of course, because of certain reasons, including the sabotage, which is happening by the United States, you can see that it is being reflected even on the African continent. So it was not the continent, the countries which were growing on the African continent during this period, they were not growing because they were industrializing. They were growing because they were selling more raw materials during that period. Of course, there is one or two countries where you can say, oh, there was reasonable industrialization, maybe like Ethiopia, which has been growing recently. But majority of them were growing because they were exporting more of the raw materials. And if you look at the patterns, that is the same pattern that is being repeated today with the United States and what it is investing in Africa is continuing to, to foster that same economic system of extracting more resources out of the African, continent. What the amount of money which the United States is investing, especially in the Central African region, Democratic Republic of Congo, Angola, Zambia, they are rehabilitating a railway there. They have invested about $250 million. It is to continue that process. They want to continue to extract the copper and all this, not to build industries in the African continent, but to continue that process. So when we look at it, we see that this growth in itself, even though it happened, it was not sufficient. All right, because you need to grow consistently over and over for a couple of generations. If you look at China, that over a period of almost 30 years, it has been growing at 10%. All right, 8 to 10%, 7, 8, 10% over almost a period of 30 to 40 years. We Africa, we were growing at this. Just a couple of countries we are growing at 6%. Some of them 5% and 7%. But it was not sustained, and yet you need to sustain it over a period of time for you to be able to lift a huge number of people out of poverty. Now that process for us has been interrupted, and of course it has been interrupted by the conflict that we are seeing. The West is starting, and of course there's a whole strategy by the West to continue to put the African continent down, because we are benefiting from the benefit from China. You are seeing that they are demonizing China, they are fighting against China. Of course, these also affect us as the African continent. So the growth has to be sustained. But if you grow for 10 years and then somebody comes and interrupts that process, then it becomes a problem. Because according to economists like a Zambian economist called Dambisa Moyo, who is in the United States, who works in the United States, who is on the board of different organizations, including Barclays Bank and all these organizations, ExxonMobil, a lot of Wall Street, organizations. She said that uh, you have to grow at a rate of 7 to 10% every 10 years for you to double your economy, the size of your economy. All right. And if you can't do this, if you cannot sustain this growth over a sustained period of time, over a given period of time, then you cannot continue to improve the lives of your people. So you grow for 10 years and someone will come and interrupt it and even possibly harvest what you have gained. But also the fact that we have not even built it on a strong foundation, that we have not established the best infrastructure themselves. That is the problem also, that this growth was temporary, was fleeting growth, that it was not based on structures that we have established on the ground, but rather, sort of like speculation that is resulting from the commodities that we are selling. So when we sell more, then it looks like we are growing, but it's not actually reflecting in improved lives of the people. So it's not part of the huge, it's not a huge part of the economy and the whole population. So that is the challenge now that we are facing, that we have to go back to the ground board, to the ground, a drawing board, and then, look at the basics and the base itself and the fundamentals.
Now, I have a last question in which I'm going to ask you about looking at to compare the state-owned, private-owned companies in the continent. But before that, what do you make of now these foreign powers or colonizers, imperialists, or even China participating in the infrastructure of building road or train, but all of them leading to port or airport, so that the goods and services, the raw materials can leave easily the country. So what do you make of that? This foreign powers participating in the infrastructure of the continent and possibly making it as if they're helping. Now we can raise, for example, just today the US is going to the US got a win over building a railway for Tanzania, from like it's something that they taken from China, it looks like. So yeah, what do you make of those things?
Yeah, so the foreign powers, I think that participating in the building of infrastructure for the African continent, I think is not a bad thing if that building of infrastructure is based on the interests of what we want, or what is the priorities, based on our priorities as a continent.
A bigger example is, of course, the Belt and Road Initiative of China, and then the Lobito corridor of US.
Yes. So if you look at that, you are building an economic zone, or you are building a railway platform that is leading to an economic zone, special economic zone that you have established, that is maybe the railway is going to be for transporting minerals and then also lead certain goods for export. You can see that this makes sense. All right. But what has been unfortunate, of course, for Africa is that these infrastructure, which have been built by majorly the West, have not been beneficial. If you look at the railway that was built by China, for example, the Djibouti, Ethiopia railway, you can see that this one at least, makes sense, because Ethiopia is a landlocked country. It needs to import in and it needs to export what it is producing via this rail and send those goods to the sea. You can see that this is, an infrastructure which is very helpful, extremely helpful. If you look at another infrastructure which China has helped, East Africa to build, the railway which comes from Mombasa to Nairobi, and which railway they're going to extend all the way to Kampala, and then of course it will go to Rwanda. You can see that this is an important infrastructure, that these hinterland countries like Uganda, they're completely landlocked, okay? And they import their goods through Mombasa port, Eastern DR Congo and Rwanda, all these countries, and Uganda and Burundi, they import their goods through Mombasa port, which is in Kenya. Now, if you build a railway here, it means that you are helping these guys to reduce the cost of imports and even use this platform to export their own goods to the rest of the world. Because these are beneficial railway systems. That someone is not just focused. Someone is not just focused on extracting minerals. Okay, and this is where the Chinese have been scaring the West, because the Chinese, ever since independence, they have an element of helping the African continent. Of course, they get benefits out of it also, but they have an element of helping the Africans. Now, compare that to the West, and the best example, of course, is the Lobito Railway Corridor, which is coming from Angola, the Lobito Railway Corridor, which is coming from Angola to the port. And even they are mentioning it themselves, actually. It comes from the Angola port in Lobito, and then it goes all the way to the Democratic Republic of Congo. And they want to extend it to Zambia, and they want to cut through and extend, to Tanzania, all right, the same railway. Now, when you look at them, what kind of goods are here that these countries are going to export? If you look at the West, what it is trying to invest in, it is not actually even investing in the improvement of lives of these people in these areas, but is mentioning. We have seen these articles on CNBC, we have seen them on Financial Times, we have seen them praising themselves. And of course, unfortunately, even African intellectuals are praising this infrastructure. And yet these people are mentioning in broad daylight that they, just this week, they transported the first batch of copper, from the Democratic Republic of Congo to Baltimore in the United States using this same railway platform. And actually, they are not building a railway. They are rehabilitating a railway which was there. That is what they are doing, so that it can take the copper faster. Now, they are saying that the reason why they want to extend the railway platform to Tanzania is because there is nickel, all right? There's a mineral called nickel in Tanzania. And the West, they just say it plain broad daylight. Okay, so it is unfortunate that some of our African intellectuals, of course, they come out and say that this is a very big help by the West, that the West has come back to Africa, has come to compete with China. I really don't see any competition by the West. When you compare them to China, I don't see any competition, versus China in this regard, because it clearly shows for them the reason why they are on the continent, and the reason why they are investing a couple of dollars, which they are investing, which is just $250 million. Is not even any amount of money that is serious, which they are investing, and they are investing in all the rehabilitation. China built a standard gauge railway from Mombasa, helped Kenya to build a standard gauge railway from Mombasa to Nairobi, and they want to extend the same railway to Kampala. It's standard gauge railway. All right. So there's a difference between the two. Now, of course, the preferred way of looking at it, it should be for Africans to build our own infrastructure and not the foreigners to build these infrastructure for us. Because when you let foreigners build this infrastructure, then you don't look at your own interests. That is number one, that you don't take care of your own interests, your burning interests, your priorities. All right, you don't look at this, and especially when it comes to the West, this does not happen, and we are seeing this with the Lobito corridor. They are not talking about the benefits. What are the benefits the Africans are going to get? They're talking about the minerals they are going to take out themselves. And of course, like I said, it's unfortunate that a lot of African intellectuals, even when you go on LinkedIn, you see that the African intellectuals are praising this as an achievement that the United States has achieved, is coming back, to compete with China, which is of course very unfortunate. So that is number one, that you don't get to take care of your own interests as people. Number two, you don't grow the industry, okay, the construction industry of building this infrastructure. Like, when will Africa have its own industry, construction industry for building railways? And how did China, reach this extent of having its own industry where it builds railways, it constructs trains, all right, it constructs roads? When will Africa reach that point? So this robs, even though you build these infrastructures, this robs the people of the country pride in the fact that we built this country, we built this civilization. This is what you're supposed to say. We built those pyramids. They say the Egyptians built those pyramids. They don't say that the Egyptians, they brought, the Asians came and built the pyramids for the Egyptians. They said the Egyptians built those pyramids. They said the Chinese built the Great Wall of China. So it robs people of dignity and pride when you bring foreigners to build this infrastructure, and of course to own them and operate them. Because look, when we look at an airport like the Jomo Kenyatta International Airport, which President William Ruto is trying to sell to the Indian Adani, if he sells it, you are selling this infrastructure for more than a generation. Even though they call it leasing, they say they are leasing whatever they call it. And of course, we can talk of even Tanzania, where they are there. Samia Suluhu is leasing a port or is selling a port. You have sold it for almost a generation. 30 years is almost a generation. So now a different civilization is going to be harvesting the value that is supposed to be taking care of your people, and you have given it out, that value to be taken by another group of people who come from a different place. So it robs people of dignity. So what if we built these infrastructures by ourselves? What if we sacrificed some of the money that is being wasted and build this infrastructure ourselves so that the value can stay here? What if we build continentally? What if we came together as a continent and built this infrastructure that we are bringing foreigners to build here? Won't we be able to build our own companies, and abilities, capabilities for building railway platforms? We should have our own companies for building railways. We should have our own companies for building, trains. We should have our own companies for building vehicles and roads. But that all is sacrificed, on the altar of expedience. And of course, that is a major problem that has to be rectified, within this generation that is coming up.
Now let's look at some of the state-owned ones. For example, Ethiopia owns the Ethiopian Airlines, which is a very successful one, and then the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, and many others in Ethiopia as well. But that's not to say Ethiopia is not encouraging privatization, not at all. And others, so that we understand, why we say state-owned institutions, manufacturing, infrastructure, or whatever is better than privatization. And because privatization is not just a loan, it comes with those hands from IMF and World Bank and others making policies for the country. So can you compare those for us?
Yeah, so privatization in itself is not bad, and of course it is even unfortunate that privatization now has become synonymous with the International Monetary Fund and the West. All right. And of course, a lot of us, including some of the Pan-Africanists, have come to hate privatization and say we need to move in the direction. And on the other side, also, the people who push privatization religiously condemn the people who say the state should lead the process of development. Okay, so there's these extremities and the line which has been drawn by two groups who are always arguing on one side to say this is privatization, should be the private sector led. And that is the dominant voice currently on the African continent, including in the heads of state. You hear private sector led growth, private sector. The private sector has its role to play, but the state in a society like ours, like I mentioned, with our foremothers and our forefathers during independence, they understood that the private sector is important. These people never say that the private sector is not important. But what they understood also is that we do not have that private sector during that period. And even this period, even though we have a GDP which has grown tremendously, of $3.5 trillion all across the African continent, that private sector has not been built up. The money which we have is almost scattered, all right, is unproductive. We have not built up a strong private sector. So that is why you see that our mining sector is dominated by foreigners, all right? The financing of major infrastructure on the African continent is dominated by foreigners. And they give these unfair, terms whereby they want to own the infrastructure, a particular infrastructure like a dam for 30 years, for 30 complete years if they build it. And during this period, they will be charging you exorbitant costs for producing electricity from that particular dam. And I'll give you an example of the Wujagali Dam, in which Total has recently bought shares in Uganda, that the president over there has been complaining about this particular dam. Of course, the country has other dams which it has built, others which were helped by China, So this dam was built, this Wujagali Dam was built by money from the West, by a consortium of Western corporations. And the cost of electricity which is coming from this particular dam is so huge. And the president has been complaining about it and saying that this dam, the cost is too high of electricity. He has been complaining about it. Huge complaint. So this is what comes from this kind of arrangement, that the terms in most of the cases are not good for us as a people, as Africans. So then this leaves us with the state that we have this money in the African continent, we have this big economy, but what is missing now is the reorganization, that the economy has to be reorganized. And the African heads of state have to understand that certain infrastructure has to be built continentally for us to unlock. Like they have already noticed that the continent needs to trade with itself, and hence the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. But how can the continent trade with itself if the infrastructure is not there? Number one, infrastructure. You are not producing enough energy. Number two, you don't have a transport infrastructure which is going to transport the goods that you are saying that people should trade. The continent should trade with itself, 55 countries, but where is the railway infrastructure that is going to move the goods? It is not there. So now there is need to understand that these have to be built, and these, we cannot give this responsibility. If we are talking about rapid industrialization of the continent, we cannot give it to the foreigners. We have to find ability within ourselves as Africans. So then this brings us to what Ethiopia has achieved, of course, with the Ethiopian Airlines, and of course the Grand Ethiopia Renaissance Dam. These are basic examples of what can be achieved by the state, because all this money to build an almost 6,000 megawatt dam, there's nowhere where Ethiopia was going to get this if it did not mobilize it by itself. Foreigners were not going to give this money. The West was not going to give this money. And the West right now is coming in to give Ethiopia the $10 billion which it needs, because it is seeing the value that is going to come from the economy after the economy has been, stimulated with this huge infrastructure. Because remember, we say that energy is one of the most important things. So they are seeing that this dam has come on board, and Ethiopia has been putting up, industrial parks across the continent. There's going to be growth around here. So we better come in and give them loans so that we can gain interest rates from these people. So that is why you see that this is one of the biggest, loans that have ever been given, even by the World Bank, a loan of $10 billion, $10.5 billion. They don't do that, on the African continent, but they are desperate because they have seen value somewhere. So Ethiopia is just a classic example of what the state can do, and the private sector cannot do this. The private sector is there, individuals to do their business, but the state should provide the best infrastructure. But even for the for the for the interest of the people or the whole nation, if you see as a state that as a public government, because you are elected in power, if you see that certain sectors, your own people, they don't have the capacity, then you should be able to set up, a company or a corporation to be able to invest on behalf of the people and make profit out of it, instead of always sitting down and raising up the hands, and somebody always saying we are waiting for the private sector, waiting for the private sector from abroad. You see, we are waiting for foreign direct investment. We are looking for foreign direct investments. And mind you, these people, they don't invest in high value industries. If you're talking about, for example, the manufacturing of trains, they're not going to give you loans to invest in that. The West is not going to come and invest in that kind of, those kind of industries. They're not going to come and invest in automobile. We look at countries and you can see that certain individuals who are nationalistic, like Dangote, they are the ones who come out and say, I'm going to put here a refinery, which is the biggest in both Europe and Africa. All right. In both Europe and Africa, this is the biggest refinery, 650,000 barrels, barrels per day. But Shell, ExxonMobil, all these companies, which are huge, Total, Chevron, have been here in Nigeria for thousands, for decades and decades. And they have never thought about building a refinery in Nigeria. Why? And yet we are talking about the private sector. Leave it to the private sector. The private sector this, the private sector that. So there's need to balance between these interests and to understand that the state should lead the process of the of the reconstruction of the African continent by investing in the best infrastructure, but also in the businesses or the companies or the interests, the resources of major interests like mining, to take care of the interests of the African people.
I was muted. Yeah, no. I said thank you very much, Kwame. I learned a lot, definitely. Um, yeah, and I am sure our audiences here did the same as well. A question, the very last comment says, "What was the trade-off receiving the loan?" Well, most of the times they don't state it to the public, but there are things I'm sure written there or just verbally.
Yeah, I think the person should go to the video which we did on the Ethiopian. There's a trade-off. We spoke about the trade-off in there. There's a couple of things which you can expect that are going to happen. So there's trade-off, like a liberalization of the so-called liberalization of the economy. That means opening up the economy to foreigners to play a role, and that means including the financial sector and others. Of course, you have now to fight back and see how you can protect the interests of the people. Of course, and it's unfortunate that other African countries have not been able to succeed at doing that. They have not been able to fight back and protect the interests of the
So
Africans
did
whenever they have
Tanzania
engaged with
get
the World
that
Bank.
contract because US, uh, yeah, because of the same thing?
Which contract? The railway,
Uh-huh.
platform which they want to extend.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
basically, the railway platform, that they want to take the resources. That is the trade-off. They
yeah.
want to take the Nico. Yeah, they want to take the Nico from Tanzania and take it to the United States. So that's basically it. So the trade-off is very clear.
Okay. Osie said, Osie Ekwam, hi Osie, welcome. First of all, the Nigerian government uses any excuse to abandon its responsibilities. They now champion, in quotation, market forces. This, as we know it, at best, an incomplete solution. How can this be changed?
Yeah. So the current, we did a video yesterday where I mentioned what can be done, but the thing is that the current generation of heads of state, I'm hesitant to call them leaders, we have to understand that they are gone. Is a gone case, is a finished case that they cannot understand where the continent is supposed to go. Or they don't have the courage. Those who understand they don't have the courage to implement the changes that are necessary, to change the continent and have rapid growth. So we have to understand that these are our enemies as a continent. I was watching a video yesterday where, Dr. Shombori is now coming out, is radicalizing. In the past, I never believed in Dr. Shombori's, approach, because she said that the African heads of state, their hands are tied. They are doing whatever they can. Our heads of state, she used to call them our heads of state, our presidents. They are working hard, but they have a problem. They are tied. Imperialism is choking them and stuff like that. What about fighting back? So somebody will ask, what about fighting back? But now recently, she has come out to be very aggressive. She has radicalized. Because I've always believed that the African heads of state, if they want it, they can do something. They need to fight back. All right, they have to fight back to protect the interests of the people. But she's now coming out to say that she was talking to the people and telling the people that if the African heads of state, if a particular head of state, a particular leader does not represent your interests, remove them. All right, this is how radical she has become. That is Dr. Chiombori. Well, of course, I respect her due to the love she has for our continent. Now, for me, I started seeing this long time ago. I think that the African heads of state have to be removed, in whatever means, that we have to employ to remove them, whether it's elections, whether it's by force. But we have to agree as a people and as a continent that they are the enemy for us. They are the closest enemy that we have. All right. They are very dangerous to the continent due to their failure to fight back to protect the interests of the continent. That is number one. And some of them, agreeing to parrot the Western narrative and talk about the so-called private sector, wait for the private sector, wait for foreign direct investment. So they agreed to parrot the narrative of the West, yet they know that this is not going to work. Some of them have convinced themselves that it is the way. People like Nanado and all the others, Ouattara, for them, they are complete sellouts. Instead of putting up a fight and fighting for the African people, they think that you should convince yourself with this false narrative and say that the private sector is the one who is going to help us. Therefore, let's continue to move in that direction. So the solution, to answer you again, is for us to understand that the enemy is the one we are having. We are seeing them, that these are the enemies, and we have to organize to remove them and bring a new system. And of course, that new system requires, for us to look within and work together with other groups, Pan-Africanists, and bring a new system. We have to define a system that we want to, institute across the African continent. But we have to be very clear, because without understanding what the problem is and who is holding the continent back, working with foreign interests, without understanding that the heads of state we have are holding the continent back because they're working with foreign interests, we are not going to go anywhere. But it starts with us accepting that responsibility. Then we'll be able to take it on and find a solution to removing them.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kwame. And thank you, everyone, for being here, for tuning in, engaging, asking, commenting, suggesting. Thanks. And with that, we call it a day from our side. It has come to an end. We will see you again tomorrow or the next one. Ciao, ciao. Bye, Kwame, and thank you.